Closed captioning of this program is made possible by the Fireman's Fund Foundation.
What's at stake for California in the highly anticipated U.S. Supreme Court ruling on health care, expected next week? The newly approved plan for Oakland's biggest development in decades at the former Army base brings hope for economic growth and jobs in the community. The Obama administration's shift in policy for undocumented immigrants continues to stir excitement and raise questions over implementation and the political fallout.
As president, I won't settle for stopgap measures.
Plus, it's a family affair in California State of Mind, the intimate documentary about former Governor Pat Brown by his own granddaughters, recognizes his role in shaping California and examines how the Brown family political legacy continues today. Coming up next. Good evening. I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me tonight on our news panel are Tom Bakar, KTVU News Consumer Editor, and Richard Gonzalez, NPR correspondent, and David Lazarus, LA Times consumer columnist, joining us from the studios of KTLA in Los Angeles. David, if there ever was a time when we could use a crystal ball, and that would be you, tell us, where are we in this, and when will the court let us know what their deliberations have brought them to rule on this?
Well, first of all, there's no percentage, Belva, in trying to second guess the Supreme Court. So anything we say is going to remain in the realm of speculation. But that said, polls that have come out, and also my own conversations with a number of healthcare experts, suggest that we have a sense of what could happen next week. On the one hand, what we're looking at is probably the conservative wing of the Supreme Court striking down the so-called individual mandate. At the beginning of this process, it had been thought that it was on solid legal footing. Now a lot of people are thinking, you know, based on the aggressive questioning during the testimony, the individual mandate probably living on borrowed time. So now the question becomes, what about the rest of the healthcare reform law? And the consensus that I'm hearing from experts is the justices might leave that standing, but that puts us into a whole new pickle, because on the one hand, the mandate goes away, meaning that people do not have to, by law, go out and buy insurance. On the other hand, still on the books would be what's known as guaranteed issue. That means that an insurer has to sell you health insurance regardless of any pre-existing conditions you might have, can't charge you more if you have any health conditions. So when you have those two together, well, it's a recipe for disaster. 8 different states have tried to have no mandate, but yes, guaranteed issue, and every single one of them ended in catastrophe as people waited until they got sick before they bought insurance, which is exactly what most people would do. You'd be nutty not to do that, and that in turn has very deep repercussions for the insurance industry, because what it means in effect is the only people who are covered by insurers are sick people. And if their sick people are the only people there, then their risk factor goes up. As risk goes up, premiums go up. And as premiums go up, fewer people can afford insurance. So what does that all mean? Well, one expert I spoke to said we're looking at probably a 20% increase in premiums, if indeed no mandate, but yes on guaranteed issue, and perhaps as many as 20 million more people uninsured. And so it's just, it takes a bad situation and makes it exponentially worse.
It's a bad situation, but is it worse for California? Are we going to be worse off because California got itself very involved in trying to do all it should do or could do to make sure that this law is implemented?
There's a few moving parts to California. On the one hand, we're already covering our bases by having laws in place to protect us from the loss of some of the more popular provisions of the healthcare reform law. So let's say the whole thing went down. California will still make sure that young people can stay on their parents' plan until they're 26, for example, or that insurers cannot turn away young people, kids who might have pre-existing conditions. That'll remain the law of the land in California. But the real question here would be, what about the exchange? California was the first state to set up one of those so-called exchanges where people who don't have employer-based insurance would be able to shop for supposedly affordable insurance. Well, if you have no mandate but still the guaranteed issue, that means the premiums are going to go up and the exchange might not work as intended. And what you could end up seeing as a result of that is the exchange kind of keeling over under its own weight. And then there's the question of what happens to things like Medi-Cal. About 8 million people are expected to be brought into the fold with an expansion of Medi-Cal funding thanks to federal dollars. Well, if this the healthcare reform law goes away, so does that money, and that in turn is going to affect spending on the people who need it most, the people at the lower end of the economic spectrum.
David, wouldn't that really put an end almost to the county hospital system? I mean, it's already overburdened with people who can't afford to pay anything. Now suddenly you throw all these new people. I mean, would this not be a disaster for California as well, just in terms of the raw dollars needed to take care of the people that are simply not going to be allowed to die on the street?
Well, that's exactly right, because the law of the land remains the fact that an emergency care situation cannot turn anyone away under any circumstances. So you will have more people going there. Well, who's going to pay the freight for that? Taxpayers on the one hand, and people who are covered by insurance on the other. Premiums will go up, taxes will go up to cover that. So essentially the situation we have now with about 50 million people in this country uninsured and the dysfunction that surrounds that, well, it becomes worse in a situation where the Supreme Court starts picking and choosing what's going to stand and what isn't. I was speaking earlier in the week with a representative for the insurance industry saying, well, what are you guys going to do if the mandate goes away but you still have to deal with guaranteed issue? They declined to speculate on the record, but off the record, what I'm hearing is they're immediately going to unleash their lobbyists, go back to Washington, first of all, try to get rid of guaranteed issue. That's not going to happen because it's very popular. So what they'll look for instead is permission to once again charge sick people more money, which is something that's now outlawed under the healthcare reform law.
Well, listen here. This story, you know, you understand, and I guess a whole lot of other people will have to start to understand it next week when the court makes the decision, which could be as early as Monday or as late as Thursday. I guess that's when they get to go home. So Washington will be the center focus for most of us. Richard Gonzalez has a story that, of course, was propelled to the headlines by an action of the president. What does it mean to allow some undocumented young people to stay in the country that previously would have been deported?
Well, Belva, there's a procedural aspect to this story and there's a political. I can talk about the procedural. You know, if you're an undocumented kid, you might be eligible to stay here and not be deported and earn a 2-year temporary work permit. You have to prove that you arrived here before your 16th birthday, that you've been living here for 5 years, that you have no criminal record, that you've got a GED or a high school diploma, or you've been a member of the military. But that means also presenting yourself to the feds when all of your life you've been trying to avoid those people. And that means giving up personal information and also getting fingerprinted. Now the question is, will people want to do that?
So have you gotten or done any interviews with young people who have to make these choices? How nervous are they?
Yeah, I've talked with young people. I've talked with the immigration advocates and the lawyers, and they're saying it's a case-by-case basis. It may not work for everybody, but you have to get some good advice. They're very concerned that there's going to be a lot of fraudsters out there. Somebody's going to say, hey, you know, $4,000, I'll make sure your application is good. Well, you know, you don't want to do that. You got to go talk to the advocates and the immigration attorneys that you know and you can trust.
But many of these people are not people that, you know, came from another country and are snuck in. They were probably brought in here when they probably weren't even cognizant of what's going on. They've been raised as Americans. They think like Americans. They have American ideals, American aspirations, American everything. And suddenly at whatever age it is, they get deported and they go back to a country they don't even know, a country that's really foreign to them.
Yeah, that's exactly what people want to avoid. And when you talk with these young people, they'll tell you, look, I'm invested here. I was raised here. Don't speak as good Spanish as my mom and dad, and I have no home back in Mexico or El Salvador or whatever. So they've got an investment here, and they when you talk with them, they really want you to understand that they want to stay and contribute. And if it means going to school, joining the military, they're for it.
Okay, David, in Los Angeles, that is where the largest number of Hispanic, some of them undocumented, live. So is this a big issue for the city of Los Angeles?
Oh, this is huge in Southern California, as have all variations of the DREAM Act. But Richard, I wanted to ask you about the politics of this. Obviously, it's a political move on the president's part to try to appeal to Latino voters. I mean, there's no question about it, but he's a politician, so why should we be shocked? I guess the question I have is, does this help to light a fire under the GOP, which just a few months ago basically shot down the DREAM Act and said that's not going to happen on our watch?
Well, what it does right now is that it puts Mitt Romney in a box. And the Obama and his people knew what they were doing. Basically, they set up the situation that where Romney couldn't come out for it because he's already on record saying he would veto the DREAM Act, and to come out for this, he would alienate his right-wing base. He hasn't said he could support it, but he hasn't said he hasn't said he actually opposes it. Yesterday, in front of a conference of Latino elected officials, he basically said if he gets a chance, he will supersede it with a long-term solution for immigration, but he didn't say what that solution is.
Well, we do know that this is a political issue and that it will carry on. But I'm not so sure what happens in real life. Does the president have to do something else, or do we just wait to see how many people sign up? When is it considered a good thing? Is it judged by the number of people who then go and get that fingerprint?
Well, the feds have 60 days to come up with the regulations for how this is going to work. So everybody's holding their breath right now and waiting to see what are those regulations say, and what will be the procedures for signing up. When that happens, we'll find out whether people will sign up or wait till November to see who's going to be the next president. If it's going to be Romney, then maybe they're going to think twice about signing up.
Well, listen, one thing we know is that jobs is at the center of both of these stories, whether it's health care or whether your status, your immigration status. And so we have a good news story about jobs. Something good happened in Oakland. Oakland's old Army base could make it possible for people to be able to pay their health care.
This is huge, especially because it's Oakland, because Oakland already is one of the world's great ports. Nobody argues about that. The trouble is that, Oakland has all the other things that are going on, but a guy by the name of Phil Tagami, who is an entrepreneur and a money guy and an Oakland native, has been the latest to propose a project to really bring the Oakland Army Base, which has been closed for 13 years, back to life. And what he proposes to do to turn it into a major warehousing and distribution center. And it's really a part of the port anyhow. When it was the Oakland Army Base, it was an Oakland Army port to send materials down to the South Pacific and to Vietnam and all of that stuff. So it's really port property to begin with. And other proposals for things like stadiums and all this stuff were thought about, but this is probably the best use of this thing. And what it could ultimately do is generate as many as 8,000 construction jobs and 4,800 permanent jobs, and these are good jobs. The controversy that almost put this thing into real trouble was what the community wanted. The community was making certain demands in order to give its approval through its elected legislators, and part of it was they wanted to make sure that at least 50% of the people hired were from Oakland and from Oakland's most impoverished zip codes. They got that deal. They also wanted to make sure that these were not just going to be the worst jobs, that these were going to be jobs with a living wage. They got that deal. And finally, they wanted something that was more controversial. They wanted an oversight board that would kind of help run this whole thing for the next couple of decades, maybe the next quarter century. And there were some sticking points there, because part of that was that on certain of the jobs, there would be no requirement to check criminal background, which works really well in construction and things like that, where that may not be an issue. But when you're talking about bonded warehousing and things like that, you don't necessarily get to do that. So there was a compromise on that. But the bottom line is that they now have till the end of next year to get construction underway, and if they do not, they lose $250 million in state funding. So this was a very important vote that was taken this week in Oakland. What stands in the way of all of this now is that there are 23 different agencies, state, federal, and local agencies that have to grant 40 permits. And anybody who knows anything about permitting in California knows that they're going to need all the time they can get, because even though this thing is essentially on a fast track now, to get those permits, to get everything in place, to get this whole thing working, this is going to be down to the wire. But it looks like Oakland is going to pull this off, and you have to give a lot of credit to everybody finally saying, let's get this thing done. Let's not just railroad it and make it wait until we're completely happy with everything. And I think Phil Tagami takes a lot of credit for that, because he was one of the great negotiators in this whole thing.
Well, Tom, I'm a proud resident of Oakland, and I'm wondering, what is this going to mean for me?
Well, I think what it means is that you're going to see, one thing, you're going to see a lot more jobs in Oakland, which means that's going to improve the tax base. There's going to be better property taxes coming out of that particular piece of property. There's going to be a lot more inventory taxes, things like that. That's all good stuff. Are you going to see more traffic? Sure you are. More trucks? Sure you are. But you're going to also see state-of-the-art things being put into this port that have not been done before. Enormous infrastructure will be built, and it'll be the best infrastructure. It'll be the stuff that will last for another 100 or 200 years. So in that sense, Oakland really benefits, because most people don't realize this, but the Port of Oakland is directly responsible, not just on the Port of Oakland, but for businesses around it, for 70,000 jobs in Northern California. 70,000. Wow. This could add another 8,000 or 10,000 jobs to that. This is enormous for Oakland, and a very good piece of news.
Okay, so David, you have a comment about this good news story for the city of Oakland?
Yeah, and I guess I don't want to, rain on the parade, because it's great that all these jobs are coming, and it's a real feather in the cap for the unions and the community activists that they got everything that they wanted. I just wonder, though, if the screws weren't turned so heavily on the developers here that it's going to, in a sense, scare away other potential developers or other potential investors who might want to bring money to Oakland, but then think, I don't want to jump through all those hoops. This is too much.
Probably the thing that will be the most scary will be for those kinds of people that are going to set up businesses in this thing. The people that might have to move in their business and then be confronted with this 50% hiring or no checking of criminal records. That may scare them a bit, but I think that's going to be ironed out. The other thing that's really good is that Port of Oakland really does need to stay in competition with where you are, Long Beach, Los Angeles, Seattle up north, Portland up north. This is an important port in the United States, but it's not so important that other ports that are truly more important, like LA and Long Beach, can't have a distinct advantage. This will give them some advantages they haven't had before, because a lot of stuff comes into the Port of Oakland that gets distributed throughout the United States by choice of those shippers. But those shippers have other choices, and this will just make it easier to make the choice for Oakland. So that's the good news.
Good news. And that also, the labor community sent out a glowing press release saying how much they valued and how much they approved of what is happening.
Well, I mean, a lot of these jobs are going to be union jobs, and the other thing is that it helps the union movement at a time when the union movement needs all the help that it can get. It suffered a lot of reversals with public layoffs and things like this. This is where most of these jobs are going to be union jobs, if not all of them, and it's going to be a good thing for organized labor, especially in a port complex.
Okay, we're going to end on a good news story, and we're going to say goodbye to David there. We thank you so much for bringing us the ins and outs of what could be decided by, probably already decided by the courts, but we'll know about it either Monday or probably Thursday of this week.
Thanks for having me, Belva.
Yeah. And an update on the budget deal between the governor and Democratic leaders in the legislature. It includes restructuring the state's welfare program, streamlining health insurance for low-income children, and reducing child care coverage and college aid. K-12 funding remains intact for now, but could be subjected to mid-year cuts if Brown's tax measure fails in November. A final vote is scheduled for next week. Well, Governor Jerry Brown's father, former Governor Pat Brown, had a profound and lasting impact on shaping California of today. In the documentary, California State of Mind, Pat Brown's granddaughter offers an intimate look at this iconic politician and the making of a political dynasty. I recently spoke with the film's director, Sasha Rice, and her sister, executive producer Hillary Armstrong, about their family and the film. First, a clip from California State of Mind, The Legacy of Pat Brown.
We don't study history enough. So I don't believe that people know Pat Brown's story. One thing about his legacy is that he was willing to take risk, and he was willing to take risk for the right reasons.
Pat Brown, when he talked about thinking big, that is the very thing that is lacking a lot of times in Sacramento. You got to be able to communicate that vision. And Pat Brown did that. He communicated that vision and he brought people in. That's what leadership is all about.
He built the water system that made Southern California possible. He built the state university system. He was a man who was interested in solutions and doing what was best for the state. He was a true Californian.
I think that government should try to do things for people, not to the point of doing everything for them, but I don't believe in seeing people suffer while government sits by and lets the individual take care of himself.
Seeing the world through the lens of Pat Brown is very valuable, and we might learn something that might give us some ideas of how do we deal with the kind of world that we now confront.
Well, you two have made a film about your family, the Browns. After all, you've got your grandfather as governor, your mom as treasurer, and your uncle now as governor of California. But knowing your grandfather seems very important to knowing California. Explain to us a bit about him.
Pat Brown, he's credited with many accomplishments, but for us, we knew him as our grandfather, and he loved people, and he was really a lot of fun to be around, and I really wanted to bring his memory back so that he could be an inspiration for people today.
Hard to imagine, though, getting the things done that he did. Maybe one of them was the fact that he won with a majority of almost 1 million votes. How did he do that?
He kissed a lot of babies, he shook a lot of hands, he was at, there's always a party that he would go to, but you really had to get yourself out there, and I think he was a very likable human being.
He's often credited with the State Water Project, which includes the California Aqueduct and the Master Plan for Education, but what's not known as much is that he was a champion for civil rights and was a fighter for fair housing and fair employment.
Talk a bit about, though, we talk about the aqueduct and the water, and we're talking about water still. What was his vision, and how has it overlaid on where we are now, where your uncle is trying to deal with those kinds of things?
Well, folks had tried to get it done for over 30 years, and it wasn't a partisan issue, it was an issue of North and South and rural and urban, and you really couldn't get people to agree, and the Northerners really thought the Southerners were trying to steal their water, and most people felt that we didn't need to worry about it, but my grandfather was quite aware of the growth that was happening, and he knew that he needed to build that.
And developing something called an educational master plan happened within his lifetime. Talk about the importance of having a master plan for education.
Well, I think a lot of people don't know that our grandfather could not afford to go to college, and he put himself through night law school. He had to pay rent to his own father, which I was really surprised when I learned that. And so education really was important to him, and he wanted it to be accessible and affordable to everybody, and we all know that's not the case today, and it's really a tragedy because that's part of what makes California great. If you can get a great education, you can get a great job. A lot of wonderful things have happened because people have had great education in California.
How and what tools did he have that today's politicians seem to lack?
I think that a lot of the issue right now is structural, and I think that there's a 2/3 vote to pass a budget to raise taxes, and that wasn't exactly the case back then. And so he used to call that the tyranny of the minority. So you need a supermajority to get anything done. So regardless of what party you're in, whoever's in power gets stuck. And then also term limits. I think he used to say that there are natural term limits when you come up for re-election.
He had a lot of turf that he covered. He signed this bill that the Fair Employment Practices piece of legislation, which had to do with discrimination in hiring.
I think one of the things that made him unique was he was incredibly candid, and he really felt strongly he needed to do what was right. And when he grew up, his mother really taught him to treat people equally, and fairness was always a quality that he valued. And I think that there's a lot of people today that have that quality, but they're a bit afraid to speak out. I will say, though, that he was unpopular sometimes when he stood up for fair housing and fair employment. That preceded the National Civil Rights Act. And the climate that was not a popular thing. He got advised to not do that, but he did it anyway, and there was a backlash, and then he fought for it.
Why did it become so important in his life that he would look out for minority groups to the expense possibly of his own career?
It was doing the right thing, and I think that my mother talks about that in the film, and that's what he taught her, that's what he taught our Uncle Jerry, it's what he taught us. And really, your integrity and your gut, that's the most important thing that you have.
Your mother, Kathleen, was the treasurer for the state. She also ran for governor herself. So what did you learn from your mom, and that maybe you got the seeds of it from your grandfather, but what did you learn additionally with your mom?
Well, we saw firsthand what a tough business it is. In making this film, we want to encourage the next generation to make a difference, a positive difference. You don't necessarily need to run for office. There's a lot of different ways you can do it. But running for office is tough. We definitely know that firsthand.
Tell us about the relationship between your grandfather and your uncle, Governor Jerry Brown.
Every father and son has, I think there's a normal tension between them, and a lot of people like to talk about their differences, but I think they're both visionaries and both very similar, and I don't think my grandfather could have been more pleased to have a son who cared so passionately about politics and public service. And he used to call him every day, as we say in the film, to give Jerry advice, and I think as a young man, Jerry found that very frustrating, but now that he's a little bit older, he talks about his father quite a lot and reveres him.
Thank you both very much for sharing with us.
Our pleasure. We hope everybody tunes in to see the film.
Of course they will.
Thank you for having us.
Yes.
Okay. Well, California State of Mind, The Legacy of Pat Brown premieres June 25th at 9 here on KQED 9. And that's all for tonight. I want to thank both of you for joining us here. Visit kqed.org/thisweek for our show archives and to subscribe to our newsletter and our podcast and to share your thoughts about the program. I'm Belva Davis. Thank you for watching. Good night.